Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Rubrics CTDL task group. This is our very first meeting, our kickoff meeting. We are so pleased to see so many of you were able to join us today. As you just heard, we are recording this meeting, and of course, we will make sure as a follow-up to it that every member of this task group receives that recording and all of the meeting materials. We certainly understand that sometimes you cannot make every meeting. Please feel free to say hello to each other in the chat while I kick things off here. For those of you who are new to Credential Engine, we are a nonprofit. Our mission has to do with credential transparency, and we accomplish that mission through a variety of programs and through infrastructure. And we're going to be focused on a piece of that infrastructure in this task group called the Credential Transparency Description Language. Our topics today are going to be introductions. I'm going to introduce everyone to the CTDL team. We're going to have a welcome to the Rubrics task group. As a part of this process, we do have a roster, and you will mark yourself as present in the roster. Nate Argo will provide a quick overview of the Credential Engine specifications and services. And then we're going to get to the real purpose of everyone being here today, of course, so that is the plan for the Rubrics task group, and Phil Barker will cover that. Our initial activity is going to be reviewing our plan and charter for you all to review and approve, and then we'll do closing and next steps. So let me go ahead and begin by introducing the CTDL and Credential Engine team. With me today is Phil Barker, metadata consultant and longtime partner with the Credential Transparency Description Language. So Phil knows this language pretty darn well. I'm Jeannie Kitchens, Chief Technology Services Officer with Credential Engine. Phil and I will be your primary contacts for this particular task group, but we have other CTDL members with us as well. Nate Argo, who will be part of our presentation today, who is a solutions architect, Deb Everhart, who could not join us today, Mike Parsons, senior solutions architect, and our Rubrics task group coordinator is Julia Gianalis, and she'll be taking over some of the logistics with this group as we move forward as well. We do have a document with shared and running notes, and the very last slide in this deck has all of our email addresses, so we are accessible to you. Throughout this webinar, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat or feel free to raise your hand so we can pause and address whatever those comments or questions are. And again, welcome to the Rubrics task group, everyone. We are so happy to see all of you here. I'm going to give you a little introduction to the process, and then Phil is going to get into a deeper dive about how we're going to go about it. The CTDL design process has been well established over the years. We've been developing the CTDL for a number of years now and have refined the process over time. And we follow policies. We have a significant managed CTDL specification policy that we're following. And in organizing this task group, that is one of our requirements that are identified in that policy. Throughout the webinar, team members will also drop links in the chat. So if there are things you want to check out now, you certainly can, but no worries, you'll have all these materials after the webinar as well. We organize task groups around specific topical areas or domains. In this case, it's clearly rubrics. We also have a CTDL annual plan of work that provides some kind of guardrails for our work so we can make sure we get an appropriate amount of work done, but allow for exploration as well. You're welcome to take a look at that plan. We have other resources that have to do with the picture that you're seeing on the right side of the slide. And you can see here that we have the CTDL advisory group, at the very top right side, the CTDL team in the middle. That's me and my colleagues here that I introduce. And we have the CTDL task groups. And this just kind of depicts how these groups interact. And you'll notice that to the left, we have Credential Engine leadership. we have staff and consultants, and we have other advisory groups, councils, and state partners. And all of that together combines into inputs that we get, the CTDL team gets, which also plays a role in these task groups. So we're able to make sure to address the needs of those groups as well. The purpose of the rubrics task group is to form a temporary group. It's a time-limited group, and we will have very specific things that we're going to work on together. This chartered group will conclude with final products, and then Phil's going to get more into that when we cover the specific activities of this task group. But it's really important to know that this work is very meaningful. It is durable. We will have very concrete outcomes from this work, including machine readable encodings, use cases, examples of best practices for encoding, a domain model for the rubrics. And of course, we're going to conclude with a final draft CTDL terms proposal that will take in all of our work together, and importantly, the use cases that you will help us to find out of this, will come out of this task group. This is a listing of the rubrics task group participants to date. And this is really, really great. You can see we have a really wonderful group of people here across a lot of different interests and domains, and thinking about rubrics from many different perspectives. I would encourage everyone who has joined today to please introduce yourself in the chat to your fellow task group participants. Say hello to everyone. Tell us a little something about yourself. We won't be doing individual introductions verbally, so please go ahead and do that. Do that in the chat. Say hello to everyone. And give yourself credit where credit is due. We have a roster, and a team member is going to drop that link in the roster. Go ahead and mark yourself as present. You'll see we have the first meeting here. It's a very simple process. Just click the drop down and click present. It's sorted in alphabetical order by first name. If for some reason you cannot access it, please let us know. Put a note in the chat, and someone on the team will go ahead and make sure that you get marked as present. This will be part of a standard thing that we'll do in each of these meetings. Anyone who attends will mark themselves as present in the roster. So please go ahead and do that. And that is my just high-level overview of kind of the background information. I'll just pause for a moment here and check on everyone, see if there's anything that came in the chat that we should pause a minute for, or if anyone has any initial comments. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Nate Argo, and Nate is going to give us an overview of Credential Engine technologies. And this is really intended to help this group just understand where the work that you will be doing fits into the big picture. Anything coming up, or should we go ahead and proceed on to Nate?
I don't see anything in the chat, Jeannie, so I think we can move ahead.
All right, super.
All right, so we're going to go over just briefly the CTDL schema that we use for documenting data about credentials and the sort of credential adjacent things, which will ultimately include rubrics, as well as the technologies we use to publish and capture and control and consume that information. So this first slide here just gives you a high-level overview of all that. First, we have the CTDL itself. That's the schema that's sort of the backbone of everything. We have a series of publishing tools. Those tools are used to publish data into what we call the Credential Registry. The Credential Registry is essentially a database of the credentials and the related things. It is not a database of people. It's not a database of who has what credentials. It's data about those credentials themselves, what they require, how much they cost, how long they take, and so on. Then we have tools that we offer for consuming that data as well. What that looks like at kind of a slightly high level is this. You have a series of what we call resources, and then in connections between those resources represented by the arrows here. There's more to it than what we've displayed here, but just to give you kind of a basic idea of what we're getting at, we have several classes in kind of the central two columns here are what we call top level classes. Those are things that have special identifiers and ways of retrieving that data directly, and then those will contain or link to data that is captured via some of the supporting classes on the left and right sides of the diagram. CTDL has been around for a few years now. You can see via these bar graphs how it has kind of grown over time. We started out covering just a very core set of things, and then as we've developed, we've actually added not just new terms to those to CTDL itself, but also the what we call CTDL ASN schema, which is more centered around competencies, as well as what we call Q data, which is quantitative data. It's a schema for capturing statistics, aggregate information, outcomes data, things like that. And you can see here on these bar charts just kind of how that's grown over time. There are other benefits to CTDL that relate to what it's built on, which is a foundation of what we call linked data, which essentially is the idea that information can be accessible on the web, that resources should link to each other, that if you want to find out about those resources, you need to grab them and crawl those links. Phil could explain that a lot better than I could. There are various benefits to that. You can read those here. But again, we kind of show how we have a number of or different types of resources and how those are all linked together. So one of the sort of gaps in the information that we capture currently would be rubric data, along with the criteria that go with those rubrics. Currently, we capture everything that you see in the diagram on the left here. We do not capture the items in the boxes in green on the right. So if we wanted to answer the question, you know, what is the what criteria were used to determine, you know, the result of this assessment, whether it was satisfactory, how would an employer know, how would a learning provider ensure that this is accurate, you know, questions like that. There's nothing that we capture currently about that, but that information is out there via those rubrics. So this group is about expanding the CTDL to be able to capture that information in a way that leverages the work that we've already done with the existing parts of the schema. And here we see kind of what we're predicting that will look like. Obviously, it's not set in stone yet, but given our experience in adding other things to the schema for similar purposes, it will very likely consist of at least one new class, potentially other classes for the criteria that will be linked to competencies, to the organizations that control the rubrics, to the assessments that assess those competencies, potentially other links as well. And then here is just a little comparison of the world of system integrations on the left, which are often very direct, very API driven, very specific to a given organization's data, versus what linked data looks like, which is where you have a series of resources that have links that are all captured using the principles of RDF and linked data in a way that gives you a graph of information that you can crawl, as opposed to something that is very specific to a given system. And to view all of this information, once it's in the registry, we have what we call the Credential Finder, which is a tool for looking up data. It's meant to show you what a user interface for this might look like. It's meant to inspire our partners to create their own similar kinds of interfaces using the tools for consuming the data that we offer. But the idea here with the Finder is that we want to show you, here's the credentials, here's all the things linked to the credentials, here's the sort of depth and breadth of the information that we capture. And this will be updated to include rubrics once we're done with that.
Questions for Nate about any of the slides that he covered? Feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to put anything in the chat.
Jeannie, this is Mike Preble from NICE and NIST. Nate, thank
Hi,
you very
Mike.
much for. How are you guys doing? I'm sorry to be joining a little bit late. just, and I know this might have come up at the top of the call, but just from sort of like a table setting perspective, we've been doing some reading and learning at our organization about knowledge graphs. And so, as for context, we manage the NICE framework. Of course, kind of an ontology contains classes and elements of those classes. When we're thinking about rubrics, and I just asked this from a terminological perspective, is that what we're thinking about? Does that equate into sort of reckoning with the knowledge graph?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Good question. Thanks for asking.
If I can provide a little bit more detail about that, what one definition of a knowledge graph is that it includes instance data, descriptions of actual entities that are out there in the world, along with the semantics about the terms that are used when describing those things out in the world. It's sometimes called the A box and the T box, a set of assertions about things in the world and definitions of the terms that are being used. And you can use the definitions of the terms to build on the assertions that are made, to infer assertions that are not explicitly made. And that is one of the things that we hope to be able to support with CTDL. CTDL is based on RDF, as Nate said, and RDF is one way of defining terms for a knowledge graph. If there are no more questions, I shall take over with a bit more information about how this task group is going to work. So we have a well-honed process for running these task groups. I don't know how many we've run, but probably about 4 a year for the past 4 or 5 years, Jeannie. So plenty, I think, is the answer. And this is the model that we've settled on. It works well. It runs very smoothly. We anticipate no more than 6 meetings over 3 months. We start by getting consensus on a charter and a plan describing the details of what the scope and processes are going to be for the work group. And that's what we hope to achieve today. We'll move on in subsequent meetings to identify additional use cases, gather real-world examples, and that's where you in the group are going to be really useful, because we're kind of relying on you to provide those use cases and examples. We'll then create a draft CTDL domain model. That's something that the core CTDL team do, if you remember Jeannie's little diagram with the different boxes in, and we bring that to you to provide, to review and provide feedback on it. We then develop and review new terms within CTDL that can be used within that domain model to provide descriptions for rubrics. We'll review encoded JSON-LD examples of descriptions, and we'll develop consensus going forwards for all of these things. We're consensus oriented. And the last thing that is a little bit different, because it's not a core part of CTDL, but it is important to Credential Engine. One of the Credential Engine's technologies that Nate covered was the registry, where we have a data store of information about credentials and things related to them. That data store needs a minimum data policy. So we will review that as part of this working group. Anyone is free to use CTDL, and you can use it without reference to the credential registry minimum data policy. So that's why this last task is slightly different, because it's the only thing that relates specifically to Credential Engine's use of CTDL, rather than CTDL as it can be used by anybody. Here's our plan for the 6 meetings that we have planned going forward from now until the end of August. Meeting today, as I've said, is focusing on the Rubrics task group plan and charter. We then move through, according to the schedule that you can see here, those other tasks that I've just described. while we're in parallel to having these meetings, we'll also be sending you information via email. We'll send you a good summary. It's a really good summary. I know from taking part in these working groups before I was working with Credential Engine, a summary of each call, and we welcome feedback and comments from you between the calls by email or any other channel that suits you. Direct commenting on Google Documents, for example. And here's a summary again of what we do that goes a little bit further. The Rubrics task group is just the beginning of the implementation process that we run. Once the task group has come up with its proposal, we enter a comment period where we let the wider world look at what we've done, and we engage specifically with several key stakeholders that Credential Engine has, and wider than that, we'll engage with the global CTDL advisory group to get feedback from people who are interested in CTDL from all over the world. Pending approval from that process, the proposal is implemented by the Credential Engine team. This means that we update our documentation of the terms with the definitions that we come up with. We update the CTDL handbook with a more human-oriented but still technical overview of the changes that we've made to CTDL. Give a description of how CTDL by the time we get to this point supports rubrics. And then we have technical work to do on the registry side, essentially implementing the minimum data policy. We have tools that allow you to publish data into the registry. They need to be updated, and the instructions and documentation for those tools gets updated. Finally, it's important to know that all of the materials and output from this process will be public information that are made available under open licenses via the Credential Engine technical site and via Credential Engine's GitHub repository. And please keep this in mind whenever you contribute, that you're contributing to an open source project, and that you must own the rights in the materials, any materials that you contribute, in order for them to go into this open source process. So, please don't contribute anything that you don't own. Okay, so I'm about to take you through the draft work plan and charter, but this seems like a reasonable point for me to pause and ask whether there are any questions on the general process that we have before I get into the details of our ask for you on reviewing the work plan and charter. Okay, so my next task is to take you through the details of the work plan and charter. We're asking for feedback. This is the draft that we are showing you. Please provide feedback either in the chat. I seem to have lost my view of the chat window, so please, Julia, Jeannie, Nate, if anything comes up in the chat, tell me about it.
We'll keep an eye out.
Thank you.
All our eyes out.
Feel free to interrupt me and provide verbal feedback. I think we've got time to cope with that, as long as we don't go down too many rabbit holes. Or if you feel that you want to make more considered comments, or you've got something that you need to think about a little bit more, you can make suggestions and comments directly in the Google document that I'll be showing you. We can make updates at any time. We can make updates during this meeting while we're talking about it, or we can make updates later if it's something that needs a little bit more thought. And at the end of this process, our ask after this meeting is going to involve the use of an online consensus form to ask whether anybody has any objections to us to the approval of this charter. Okay, this is where I try to do two things at the same time, because what I hope you can see now is the presentation slides on one side and a view of the Google Doc of the charter on the other.
Yes, looks good, Phil.
Okay, let's see whether this works. Let's see whether I can navigate two screens at the same time. What I plan to do is to take you through the charter with the bullet points for discussion in the presentation. And the general overview is provided here in the table of contents. You'll see that we have sections on improving credential transparency globally, which covers what the Credential Engine does and the role that CTDL plays in that. We have the roles of Credential Engine's groups, which is an outline of the Credential Engine's organization around CTDL development. And these essentially cover what we've told you in the introduction for this presentation, for this webinar. And you'll see there's the diagram that Jeannie used describing the structure of Credential Engine. Obviously, you're welcome to comment on this if anything is unclear, or if you spot any typos, or that there's any clarification required. But this describes Credential Engine as it is, so there won't be any substantial changes that need to be made. Really, we just ask for you to check this to ensure that you understand what it says, and that what it says is clear. We then move on to the overview of the Rubrics task group. And the key part here is the bit that's in bold, especially the first sentence of it, that rubrics are key to understanding competencies in relation to credentials and jobs. And that's something that I want to make sure is suitably acknowledged all the way through, that we're not just talking about academic assessment. We're talking about assessment as it can apply in people's employment, people's occupation. We're talking about things, assessments that might be made during the hiring process, recruiting process, or during any advancement processes, staff review processes, anything like that. So any review of activities that a person does during their occupation may be supported by a rubric. CTDL does cover things like occupational credentials, but it also covers occupations, jobs, employment in general. And we are really keen to make sure that we cover the whole of the education to employment world, because that's what's relevant to credential transparency. So we would like the description of the skills that are required for a job to be as transparent as the description of skills that somebody has that are attested by a credential that they hold. So the first thing that I'd like you to check is that our description of rubrics and what we cover fully encompasses that world of employment and education. The next thing is just a summary again of what the Rubrics task group will do, which is based on the process that I described earlier, but in a slightly more specific detail. So if there is anything about these, what's covered on this slide that's unclear, now would be a good time to interrupt me, or maybe there's something in the chat.
Yeah, I just put a note in the chat, Phil, just saying that, please, you're empowered, provide input. It's critical. And just I'll just provide an example in our most recent task group, the support services task group, which work has been completed and the CTDL updated. We ended up changing this overview pretty we made a lot of changes to it through input. It was very, very valuable input. So please don't be shy. Go ahead and speak up. You are empowered here. All input is good input for everyone to hear and to minimally be considered. And if we need to change this, we can do it. It's not a problem. So love to hear the different perspectives. And I don't want to pick on anyone, and thanks for the grammatical corrections too. But Steve Nordmark, we just happened to chat the other day, and you were talking about rubrics that you had developed and just specifically for credentials and some, kind of more visionary work that was going on with rubrics that maybe were building off the past, but maybe thinking about things a little bit more differently. Please, if this doesn't seem, futuristic enough, let us know.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. I
Yeah.
like what I see. This is Steve Nordbeck. I like what I see. And as I said in the earlier mention, the work that I've been doing on the educator micro-credential efforts over the past 7 years, the rubrics are absolutely essential to further advancement of competency-based frameworks. So what I see is consistent with that. And the work that we've done is, talking about maybe the building of linkages of rubrics across credentials, but I think you can communicate that from credential to credential if you talk about stacking and sequencing. So the rubric within a particular credential is much more isolated to the one thing I didn't explicitly see here, but I'm sure will come out as we talk about it, is maybe domains within a particular rubric. So components that belong to domains or whatever terminology you want to use, like categories, subcategories, domains, components, so forth.
Right.
Certainly, when we come to the domain model, the data model, and start working towards a schema, we'll definitely be considering those. Quick question: since this was written by me and I speak and write in British English rather than US English, should practice be with a C or an S for you?
We normally use a C. So.
Okay.
Of course, we did invite anyone to participate with this task group, no matter where they work from. So I know we have at least John, who's I think also located in Scotland. So definitely know also that we're, in terms of the language, I think there's things that are fine to represent that global audience. I just want to mention that as well. And somebody raised their hand. I saw a hand come up.
Yes. Miranda from Automation Works. I realized I came in a couple minutes late and I had a couple little technical difficulties, so this may have already been discussed. But I was wondering, at what point in a person's learning journey are we starting this with? Is the goal to be able to incorporate people who have high school diplomas, maybe only a GED? Are we starting with people that have some college but not quite finished? Or like where is our starting point of?
You want to take that, Jeannie?
Well, great question, Miranda. First, it'll be really important. And when we look at the charter, we're going to see that one of the things we're not going to do is design for personally identifiable information. But we also realize that obviously rubrics are used for the purpose of people, right? Accomplishing, whatever it is that they're supposed to accomplish and meet whatever the benchmarks are in that rubric. So we totally understand that. We will not be creating terms in the CTDL, though, that are about personally identifiable information. So there's that part. Then the other part of the CTDL is not like grade specific or domain specific. We cross, domain came up earlier. Rubrics can be for any domain, any industry, any kind of curriculum, and I would say any kind of grade level. So when we're thinking about the use cases for the rubrics, which will be something that we'll do after we all, get consensus on the charter, you'll be able to contribute the use cases, and you'll be able to come up with use cases that have to do with things, like the kinds of things that you mentioned, because a use case can still bring that person, that individual into the use case. We just simply won't be creating specific personally identifiable information terms. Instead, we'll be defining terms that help create rubrics in a way that others can use that for personally identifiable information. So all grade levels are good.
Okay. All right.
Does that
I
help?
guess I'll just have to watch, allow you all to continue with your presentation. Because in my mind, I'm just thinking that the rubric, there's going to be more content needed for a person that's at a lower domain versus someone that has already completed certain things. I'll use, for example, if a person has a GED and now they're going for their certification because maybe they are, they don't necessarily fit the college model for a student, they're going to be missing certain criteria that a person that's already done those first years or 2 years in a 4-year university, or maybe if they just have an associate's degree. So that in my mind, I'm thinking that there would be different rubrics for, so I understand we don't necessarily want to make it grade specific, but there will definitely need to be more than one version of the same rubric, maybe adding in a couple of extra items for that certification for a person that's missing a little bit.
Yeah, Miranda, you just gave some excellent use cases. So hang on to those in your mind for sure. Those are really good. And we'll be in our next meeting, we'll be delving into that, and you'll have a tool for, providing those use cases so we can do our design around those multitude of important use cases.
Absolutely.
I think something else just came up in the chat. And is there any other raised hands? Let's see.
I had
Sean?
an additional question, Jeannie. This is Steve online. So are we stopping short of getting toward the interoperability elements that organizations like One Ed Tech would use for developing standards of how, other systems would start to use these? So help me understand that context.
Yeah. And then, sure. And then we've got a question from John Robertson in the chat, but I'd ask Phil or Nate to address Steve's question on data design.
Okay. Yes. We will be producing something that can be encoded as JSON LD. So it can be used for system-to-system interoperability. We don't do so in quite the same way that One Ed Tech do, because we have a stronger leaning towards linked data than perhaps they do. So we except for the purposes of the registry, we don't define what the minimum data is, for example, and we don't, we recommend, but we don't mandate controlled value spaces to be used for relevant properties. So what we provide is something that is what we call the registry profile of CTDL is something that can be used as a basis for interoperability. CTDL itself is something that can be used to build several multiple different profiles that can be used for system-to-system interoperability. I'm just pausing while I'm reading John's question. Did that answer your question, Steve?
Yes, thank you very much, Phil. Appreciate it.
Okay, good. So John's question, at the risk of asking an obvious question, I've never known John ask an obvious question, is the intent that the output of this group about rubrics could be applied to a credential, a piece of a credential assessment, but not an individual's work to fulfill a credential, or is that also in scope? Application to an individual's work to fulfill a credential, I think, is in scope. What's not in scope is the recording of that individual's performance against the credential, because then you're getting into the personally identifiable information that we steer clear of. Does that answer your question, John?
I'm trying to think what that latter one would look like then.
So what I'm thinking when you say something that could be applied to work to fulfill a credential, what one way of using rubrics, as you know, is as marking schemes. So something like a marking scheme would be in scope, but actually recording what marks an individual got would be out of scope. But everything else, saying that, if the competency is knot tying and you want to give a certain percentage of the mark for the speed that the knot is tied, a certain percentage for the neatness of the knot, and so on, that sort of thing would be in scope. Okay, if there are no more questions, I shall move on. The outcomes section, again, describes the process. It's process oriented. So yes, please fix my grammar, make sure everything is clear on here. The task group composition is what it is. This was included, the details of the type of people who are on was included in the invitation. So you presumably all found it intelligible and something that you could relate to. It's not too late to say, hey, you've missed this certain type of person who should be involved. So please tell us if there's something that's not covered by these bullet points that we should to whom we should reach out. The next thing that's important, and this is key, I think, to the work that we do, is the scope. What's in scope and what's out of scope. What's in scope are the things that we've discussed as being the tasks that we'll work through: developing use cases, creating additional CTDL terms to best meet the needs of the identified use cases, providing feedback to extend and refine the CTDL domain model, providing real-world data examples that support the use cases, defining a minimum data policy for CTDL terms that's applied to the credential registry. That's what's in scope. In general, I noticed that there was a question earlier about what's in scope for the sort of the examples that we ask for and the use cases. In general, if you're not sure whether something is in scope or out of scope, please provide us with the information anyway. And we might politely say, sorry, that's not somewhere that we want to go. But we would rather see the specific examples before we try to rule anything out with a sort of blanket out of scope statement. That said, there are some things that are out of scope. Ways of including personally identifiable information, that's not somewhere that we go. We leave that to other people. Developing policies for other organizations on the development of rubrics is something that's out of scope for us. Determining whether rubrics are effective or ineffective, either as a general tool or individually. We're not going to make quality judgments on individual rubrics. Our general approach, this applies to credentials and everything else, is to provide transparency of information so that other people can make quality judgments, and that will apply to rubrics as well. Customizing implementations for systems or applications is out of scope for this working group. And promotion of any specific approach to rubric development, format, or representation is out of scope. And on that last one, I'm not we're not saying that, if you have a particular approach that you like, we're not saying that you're not allowed to talk about it. By all means, do represent that approach, do represent that format or representation. Tell us about it, but do so in the context of what we're trying to do in this group, in the context of trying to meet the identified use cases and address the example data that we have. I see we have a little over 10 minutes left. I think we have time for a little bit of discussion if anybody's got any questions about scope.
We do. We definitely have time for discussion with the 10 minutes that are left. So if anybody would like to raise your hand or put something in the chat, this is the perfect time to do it. I think
we wait for too long, somebody's going to think of something.
Oh, okay. Well, and I can see that we have a number of comments that have been added. Would anybody who put a comment in like to say anything? Jennifer, Jim, and Margaret, thanks for the details that you put in there as well. Would anybody like to chat about the comments you put in? If you don't, that's fine, but we do want everyone to feel perfectly comfortable speaking up.
I had a question. This is Steve Nordmark. So within the scope, and we're talking about use cases, are we talking both about the end user who's reading the rubric as well as the person who's authoring the rubric, as well as the person who's using the rubric to score and provide feedback?
Yes. And we'll go into more detail about this in the next call. We have a format that we use for our use cases. We tend to write very brief use cases that are of the form as a describe your role. I want to describe what you want to do, and then additional information following on that might, put some, constraints or provide additional context. So, we're very much interested through the use cases in surfacing all those different people who might have an interest in rubrics as well as what they will want to do. So we will hopefully be identifying lots of different actors as well as tasks.
And Mike put a note in the chat. Are there sample rubrics or articles on rubrics for us to read, or should we help by looking for materials? Definitely want your materials.
We want yours. We've got some. We do have. The answer is yes. There are some sample rubrics and articles on rubrics that make a note for us to send those out before the next meeting. But we definitely want examples from you as well.
Yes, we will be making that request. And again, if you can share information, we're going to ask you to share it, including those examples and samples. We will need those real world examples because we are going to create encoded examples based on real world things. So we must have, we must be able to validate our CTDL updates.
Yeah. And we'll be working towards producing, examples of data, and where we can, we will base those on real world examples of rubrics.
Yeah. Okay.
Jeannie, all I was going to say is I put my comments in. It's related to everything that we're talking about, and
Right.
a really big issue that we have. So if you guys have any questions or I wasn't clear, just let me know. But I think there is an opportunity to really assist with that. And until we get to a point in which we can acknowledge that people aren't always going to use the same scale and deal with that, I think we're going to continue to run into adoption and implementation roadblocks. So let me know if you need any more, but I hope I was clear enough. That's just all.
That sounds like a use case, and I
Yeah.
agree. It's
Right.
definitely real world use case there.
Yes, 100%.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate
No
it.
problem.
Okay.
Okay, so I shall move on. It's okay, Jeannie? Yeah.
Yeah, let's move on.
Move on. So obviously we want you to approve this charter. And to do that, we seek consensus. Feel free to, if you want to read it in more detail, feel free to wait. It's not something that you have to do right now during the call, but you won't be nagged until you do this. Oh, thank you, Julia. So I was just going to ask Julia to put a link to the consensus form in the chat. This will also be sent to you in the email follow-up from this call. As I've said, make the feedback, put comments into and suggestions into the charter if you want. But when it comes to the consensus form, you have two options. Either accept it as it is, or point out a specific issue in the charter that prevents you from accepting it, and provide us with a solution, a remedy for that issue, so that we get actionable feedback on the charter. The form is very simple. It simply requires that we know who it is who's provided the feedback, and as I say, either consent or an issue that can be fixed. So that's our ask of you, our main ask of you between now and the next meeting.
And we go through every comment and every suggestion. So please know that every comment gets read. And as Phil noted, if there's changes that we should make, we will make them. If it's something that we feel should not result in a change, for example, to the charter, maybe it's just more informational about, say, like the use cases or so forth, we'll acknowledge the comment. Or if it's something that we cannot include with the charter, then we will politely, decline and let you know the rationale, the reason why for that. So please, you are empowered, not powdered, powered to go ahead and provide your feedback.
And we will start the next call either with further discussion on the charter if there are pending issues, or with the news that it's been accepted, and a short summary of any changes that we made during the process.
And since you've got it there, Phil, you want to just go ahead and click next, because we're really at the very last
Go on. Yeah.
couple of slides. So review the plan and charter, use the online consensus form. As I said, the CTDL team will be looking through all the comments. We actually meet every single week. So we'll be on top of the work with this, and behind the scenes, we will be readying for our next meeting in 2 weeks. We like to keep that 2-week cadence, and typically between those meetings, we have a lot of work to do behind the scenes to prepare. So we will be doing our preparation as well. We look forward to seeing everyone at the next meeting on June 28th. Please feel free to reach out to us. We are as accessible as we can be. So in between then, if you want to contact us, please feel comfortable doing that as well. Anything else anybody would like to add? Well, yeah, and there's resources. We always send a follow-up email with, you will definitely get it. If you don't get it today, it will be tomorrow. We always include the recording, all of the resources from the meeting, and additional resources in case you want to take, look at some additional materials that we had mentioned during the meeting. So those are always available to you. In our Google Drive folder, you all have access to all the meeting materials now. Those will be there, in perpetuity throughout this process for you to access at any time. And here you have our
Finally,
email address.
That's who you
Yes.
are. Yep. Feel free to reach out to me or to Jeannie if you have any further comments.
Yeah, please do. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to work with all of you. We're really excited to get this work going and seeing you in the next meeting. Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you all.
Have a great day. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to this collaboration.
Super, thank you.